Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a bit of a detour, heading high up into the Rockies,
Yeah, we're focusing on an animal that you often hear, but, rarely really see.
the American pika.
Yeah.
And we're digging into some really crucial new research, mainly from the University of Colorado Boulder.
And the findings are, well, they're a bit of a wake-up
A
call.
wake-up call is a good way to put it.
Right. I mean, our mission today is to see the pika as more than just a cute, noisy animal on a hiking trail.
Okay.
It's a critical indicator species. And this research isn't some broad model. It's based on decades of watching one single population.
That's incredibly specific.
Incredibly. And that gives us the clearest data yet on how fast things are changing up there, and maybe more importantly, what that signals for the millions of people who depend on those same mountains for their water.
Okay, so the subject is the American pika, Ocha tona princeps. If you spent any time hiking at high elevations, you know the sound. It's that sharp little "ipe."
That's the one. It echoes off the rocks. They're like these little furry sentinels.
And they are very good at letting you know you're in their territory.
They are. And that sound, that's what we might be losing. What makes this CU Boulder research so significant and frankly so worrying is its main finding.
And what's that?
It's about recruitment, which is just, a scientific way of saying how many young pikas are actually surviving to join the adult population.
Right, the next generation.
Exactly. And that number has plummeted since the 1980s at this one site.
Plummeted.
Yeah.
That sounds like a population heading for a cliff. But before we get into the data, let's talk about the pika itself. Why is this tiny animal, it's about the size of your fist, why is it so vulnerable?
It really all comes down to their physiology. It's almost a paradox.
How so?
They're small, herbivorous mammals. Surprisingly, they're close cousins to rabbits and hares.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
Most people don't. And they're built for extreme cold. They ling up in these high, rocky places year-round. They have these round ears, dense fur. They're basically little fluff balls.
So they look like they'd be perfectly happy in a blizzard.
Oh, they are. But that same design, the thing that's perfect for winter, becomes their fatal flaw in the summer.
Okay.
Pikas are so sensitive to temperature, they can only survive in this really narrow thermal range. And critically, they have no effective way to get rid of metabolic heat.
Metabolic heat.
Yeah.
So the heat their body generates just from, moving and digesting.
Exactly that. When you or I get hot, we sweat. The dog pants, pikas. They can't do either of those things.
No evaporative cooling at all.
None. So if they spend too much time in temperatures over, say, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, they can actually die from overheating. They're basically operating in a biological pressure cooker.
Wow. So if they're stuck making all this heat and they can't sweat it out, what's their emergency plan?
Their plan is all about geography. They just retreat. Their whole survival strategy is to find a nice, cool space immediately.
And that space is the rocks themselves.
Exactly. The talus slope, that big jumble of boulders and it acts like a natural refrigerator. They dart out for food, but the second it gets too warm, they have to dive deep into the gaps between the rocks to cool down.
And as the lead researcher, Chris Ray, pointed out, that little pika, yell at you, is part of the whole experience of being up there.
It is.
When that sound is gone, it's not just an ecological loss. It feels like a loss of the place itself.
It's a silence that carries enormous meaning, And that brings us to the real strength of this study. It wasn't just some random patch of rocks they looked at. This is based on 40 years of work in one specific location.
Okay, so tell us about the site. What makes this data so solid?
The site is the Niwot Ridge Long-Term Ecological Research Site in Colorado. If you know the area, it's north of Nederland, just south of Rocky Mountain National Park.
Classic high country.
Perfect pika habitat. Sweeping tundra, steep hillsides covered in those boulder fields they love.
And these long-term sites, they take incredible dedication. This didn't just start recently, did it?
Not at all. The foundation for this was laid back in 1981 by a former CU professor named Charles Southwick.
81. Wow.
Yeah, he spent nearly 10 years, until 1990, tracking and tagging pikas on that very ridge. Just think about that fieldwork in those conditions.
And that gave the current team the perfect baseline.
The crucial baseline. So Chris Ray and her team could come back to the exact same spot, use the same methods, and get a direct apples-to-apples comparison between the 80s and today.
They did a snapshot in 2004 and then a really deep dive from 2008 to 2020.
That's right. And the team included a former undergraduate, Jasmine Vidrio, which is great to see. They published it all in Arctic, Antarctic, and alpine research.
Okay, so they take Southwick's data from the 80s, they put it up against their modern data. What was the big seismic shift they saw?
The shift was, yeah, chilling is the right word. The analysis showed the proportion of trapped pikas that were juveniles.
The young ones.
The youngest generation, yeah, had fallen by approximately 50%.
50.
A 50% drop in recruitment over just a few decades.
50%. That is staggering. That's not a subtle decline. That's a massive change in how the population is structured.
It is. It means the population now is heavily skewed toward older adults.
So they're surviving, for now.
They are, but the conveyor belt of new life just isn't running properly.
Yeah.
You get a population that's aging out without being replaced, and that's the textbook definition of a population heading for local extinction.
What's so interesting is that it's not a sudden die-off of adults. It's this quiet, slow failure of the next generation to get started.
Precisely. And this is where the climate connection, even if they can't prove it for every single pika at this one site, it just becomes overwhelmingly illogical.
So if there isn't one, like smoking gun for Niwot Ridge, why are we so sure climate change is the main driver here?
Because it aligns perfectly with what predictive models have been telling us for years. We've known rising summer temperatures would put pikas at risk. This just confirms those fears with hard data.
Yeah.
We saw studies back in 2016 suggesting pikas could vanish entirely from places like Rocky Mountain National Park by the end of the century.
It all comes back to that physiological vulnerability, that inability to cool down. It's not just about surviving in one spot, is it? It's about movement.
That is the key insight, especially for the young ones.
Yeah.
The juveniles, they have to find new territories, so they need to move from one habitat patch to another.
Which means they have to cross open areas.
And to do that, they inevitably have to go down in elevation, even if it's just a little bit.
And down means hotter.
Exactly. When they try to disperse, they hit these hot conditions that they just cannot tolerate. We talked about their lack of cooling mechanisms.
So the landscape itself becomes a barrier.
It creates a hot moat, is what you could call it. An impassable barrier of heat separating these islands of good habitat. The journey itself can be deadly for the young pikas.
That is just a terrible physiological trap. The adults might be okay, tucked into their cool rocks, but the new generation is blocked from expanding.
And we're even seeing the stress on the adults who do survive. Chris Ray, the researcher, she shared this really vivid story.
Yeah.
Back in the 90s, she tagged this one male pika. They nicknamed him Mr. Mustard because of his yellow air tags.
Mr. Mustard, I like it.
And he lived for 9 more years as an adult, which is an incredible lifespan for a small wild animal.
That suggests a pretty healthy, low-stress environment back then.
It does. But Ray says that today, she just doesn't see that anymore.
Wow.
And that observation, on top of the recruitment data, it paints a really stark picture. It's not just that the young are dying. The overall health and lifespan of the surviving adults is probably shorter, too.
A double hit. Fewer babies, and the adults don't live as long. So let's zoom out. Why does the quiet disappearance of this one little animal matter to someone listening, hundreds of miles away?
Because the pika is a classic indicator species. They're visible, they're measurable, and because of their extreme sensitivity to heat, they're the earliest warning sign. They're the canary in the alpine coal mine.
And these alpine ecosystems aren't some remote, isolated places. They're directly connected to our own lives.
That is the critical link this research forces us to make. Chris Ray calls the pika's habitat. She calls it our water tower.
Our water tower. Okay, walk us through that metaphor. How does the health of a pika's home affect what comes out of our taps?
The water supply for a huge part of the western U.S. depends on high elevation moisture. We rely on the seasonal snowpack, of course, but also on the seasonal ice and the permafrost.
The frozen ground.
The frozen earth under those rocky talus slopes where the pikas live.
So we're talking about the geology itself acting like a giant natural sponge.
A frozen sponge, precisely. And that ground ice, that permafrost, it melts later in the summer.
Okay.
That slow, gradual melt provides a steady stream of water at the exact time of year when reservoirs are lowest. And human demand for cities and farms is at its absolute peak. It's our late summer reserve.
So if the pika's home is literally the roof of our emergency water supply, what does the pika's decline tell us about the foundation?
It signals instability. If it's getting hot enough to create a hot moat that kills young pikas, that same heat is destabilizing the ice and permafrost under those very same rocks.
The fate of the pika is directly tied to the melting of the Earth itself.
It is. So the decline of this one small animal, it's not just an ecological curiosity, it's a proxy measurement for the stability of our essential infrastructure.
Problem isn't just the pikas, it's the warming system that feeds our reservoirs.
That's the connection this research forces you to see. That 50% drop isn't just about losing biodiversity, it's an early warning about our water security.
So that really brings us to the end of this deep dive. The takeaways are pretty stark. The Niwot Ridge data shows this 50% crash in juvenile pika numbers.
Right, driven by their extreme vulnerability to heat.
Which makes the very landscape they live in impassable for their young. And most critically, the pika struggle is a direct, measurable signal of stress on the systems that supply water to millions of us.
What's so fascinating is how this research connects the absolute smallest detail, this tiny mammal, to our largest human concern, infrastructure.
Yeah.
The quiet disappearance of the pika signals that the very systems holding our water reserves together are under stress. So if the pika's fate is tied this directly to the health of the ground beneath the rocks, you have to ask, right?
What other quiet signs are we missing?
Exactly. What other biological or physical indicators are we ignoring in these high-elevation ecosystems that directly affect our daily lives? And, what's it going to take for us to recognize those signals before we hit a real breaking point?